This programme is all about bringing you practical insights on some of the biggest challenges and opportunities facing in-house legal teams. Today's focus is on helping you and your team respond to what has been described as a global data privacy landscape undergoing transformative changes, reshaping the way organisations handle personal information. This is a very practical, discussion-focused session. As always, we'd really encourage you to get involved, sharing your perspective, comments or questions in the chat as we work through today's discussion. So without further ado, I'm excited to welcome back to the Client Experience Programme Antonis Patrikias to introduce you to the team and to host today's session. We hope you enjoy it. Over to you, Antonis.
Hi everyone, it's Antonis Patrikias here, a privacy, AI and cyber partner based in London. I co-chair the firm's Global Privacy and Cybersecurity Group. Today's session is about the changes that are currently happening around the world in relation to privacy regulation. And we thought that there's just so much happening around the world that it's really difficult for us and our clients to stay on top of developments, cut through the noise and figure out what it is that we actually have to do in practice. And in order to help address this question, I'm delighted to have here with me four of my distinguished partners from a global privacy and cybersecurity group, to whom I'll pass now so they can introduce themselves. So in order of appearance on the slide, Robin, why don't you go first, please?
Lovely. Hello, everyone. I'm a partner in Melbourne in Australia, and I lead the Privacy and Cybersecurity Group in Australia, and I also lead the Tech Sector Group. So we're very pleased to be here.
Thank you, Robin. Todd?
My name is Todd Aubert. I head up the US Technology Communications Group, and it includes privacy and data security.
And Zdeněk?
Hello, good afternoon. From Czech Republic, from Prague. My name is Zdeněk, and I had the local TMT practice in Central Europe.
Thank you, Zdeněk. And last but not least, Kirsten.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kirsten Thompson. I lead the privacy and cybersecurity practice in Canada. It's lovely to meet you all.
Thank you very much. If we can move to the next slide, please, Natalie. So we chose to focus on three topics today. The first one is global privacy regulation and what is changing around the regions that are represented by my colleagues today. The second one has to do with the always important and always challenging question of cookies and online advertising. And finally, last but not least, what does the advent of specific AI regulation actually mean for our privacy program and our data governance efforts? We've tried to build interaction into the sessions. So for each of the topics that we will discuss, we will start with a poll that we will kindly ask you to tell us what you think are the most important elements. And as you vote, we'll leave the poll open for 2-3 minutes. As you vote, we'll start a discussion among the Dentons team. And please, 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 we do invite your questions, your concerns, your contributions, which you can share at any time in the chat room. So if we can move to the first topic and the first survey, please, Natalie and Eve. So there we go. We'd like you to tell us what is the most challenging. We know that all the items that we've listed here, but what are you finding the most challenging aspect of this proliferation of non-harmonized, very far-reaching, with very significant consequences, privacy, cybersecurity, and AI laws around the world? What is your main pain point? Is it time? Is it cost? Is it complexity? Is it the fact that you can't really tell what is the real risk? Or is it the virtual impossibility of adopting globally consistent approaches operationally whilst respecting each and every technical legal requirement of every law around the world at all times? So if you can start voting, and we'll give you a heads up before we close the vote. But to get the conversation going, Robin, over to you. What are your thoughts around what is really challenging around the proliferation of global privacy laws and what's happening in Australia?
Sure. So, look, there's no shortage of laws that are sort of rapidly coming down the pipeline in Australia too. And so, for example, in Australia, what we've seen is, obviously an exponential increase in the fines that are for repeated and serious breaches. They're now, 50 million Aussie. So that's, about 32 million US is the maximum, or 30% of turnover, or the benefit derived from it, proportion of that as well. So, that's a significant change. We're also seeing some online safety laws, expanded consumer data portability rights, and really an expansion of laws regulating, critical infrastructure that's traditionally focused in the past on, ports and pipelines. And now that's actually, been expanded to 11 sectors, capturing anything like the healthcare sector and insurance sector and banking sector and things like that. So a very broad definition there. So there's going to be a massive change in 2024, a wholesale reform of the privacy laws. Obviously, new AI regulation is coming down the pipeline too. We're also seeing standards getting developed for digital identity verification, and specific standards for safety in sectors like, social media, digital apps, stores, and that sort of thing. And then, further expansion of the cybersecurity laws regulating critical infrastructure. So it's typical, I think, of what's going on around the world.
Thank you, Robin. Sounds like there's quite a lot happening across different domains. Let's move to Canada now. And before Kirsten talks as to what's happening there, just to give you a snapshot of how the survey is developing, we seem to have a clear leader. 34% of our clients participating today think that the most difficult thing to do is basically stay on top of developments. And right now, the runner-up is consistency. It's very difficult to implement consistent approaches globally. So let's keep the survey open for another minute or so. And in the meantime, Kirsten, what is happening in Canada? And does this idea that clients are struggling to stay on top resonate with you?
Oh, absolutely. Canada is in the same position as Australia with respect to sort of refreshing all its privacy legislation. So it's quite a challenging jurisdiction right now, with laws changing all over the place and new laws being introduced. Spoiler alert, the laws are not getting less stringent, they're getting more stringent. We started with our province of Quebec. Just before I do that, let's do an overview. So we've had privacy laws for about 20 years, but they've been based on an ombudsman model, and our privacy commissioners haven't had any power. They will investigate, and when they find you've done some wrongdoing, they issue a non-binding report and tell you that you've behaved badly and send you to the corner to think about your sins. Obviously, that does not work so well. Well, it does work on Canadians. We apologize and immediately correct our behavior. But our privacy ombudsmen are now becoming more along the lines of true regulators. So first change was in the province of Quebec, which took the GDPR and adapted it to the Quebec environment, which is to say it took GDPR, turned it into a consent-based regime and got rid of all those handy sort of exceptions and other bases for processing. So that law is in effect and is proving quite challenging. Also has those whacking great penalties, fines, and private rights of action that you see under the GDPR. Federally, our overarching privacy law is undergoing, it's basically being rewritten, again, looking a lot like the GDPR with some interesting quirks. Also penalties, fines, order-making powers being introduced. Bill C-27 is just been moved to clause-by-clause review, so we expect it should be passed end of 2024, early 2025. So I would expect most of it to come into effect in 2025. We also have a Cybersecurity Act that's working its way through that will address cybersecurity infrastructure, critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure is defined quite broadly, so you may actually be employed at a critical infrastructure, a designated piece of critical infrastructure without even knowing it. So pay attention to that one. It mostly talks about the sort of data security and infrastructure security requirements. And just introduced recently was the Online Harms Act, which would hold sort of online platforms accountable for hate speech, dissemination, those kinds of things. Very controversial here. It's unclear whether that will pass. If it does not, I'm sure there will be another bill to follow it. So that's sort of where we're at. Lots of things going on. Oh, and Bill C-27 also introduces an Artificial Intelligence Data Act, also working its way through.
Thank you, Kirsten. So I think the one last summary is you guys are ramping up big time. It's all heading GDPR way, but harder. Is that a fair summary?
I think that's fair.
All right. Okay. That's
We
promising.
prefer unique, more unique.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And Quebec is in particular a really, really difficult jurisdiction. So thank you very much for that. Niamh, if we can please close the survey and bring out the results, and gradually we can move to the United States, where I hope our American friends, being the pragmatists that they are, hopefully they have a better story to tell us. But let's take a look at the survey results first, if we can, please. So, as previewed, 33% of our clients think that staying on top of developments is the most challenging thing, and then complexity and difficulty to take consistent approaches come up as runner-ups. One interesting observation, which you also saw in the first session that we ran yesterday in the APAC region, is that not many of our clients are actually concerned about costs of implementations, which I find interesting. So Todd, over to you. First of all, initial view, is there anything in the survey results that comes as a surprise to you? But then most importantly, please tell us what is happening in the United States, and please tell us it will be easier for our clients there.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Antonis. Looking at the poll, it's not surprising. It's one of the biggest struggles that all of our clients face. And I just wanted to take this moment to note that we're in the process of launching a global privacy coalition that will be focused on trying to harmonize some of the differences, because we all know that right now it's nearly impossible to have a simple, straightforward compliance regime that is 100% in line with each of these different requirements around the world. So this could be a really good place for people to have one-stop shopping, to know what's going on, to have the ability to participate with other companies and try to influence what requirements and interpretations are coming down the line. So please feel free to reach out to your DITN's contact to learn a little bit more about this, and we'll be happy to continue the conversation. So for the US, one might think that we're following GDPR, given that we have so many new data subject access rights requirements coming in through the states, but it's not really true. We're still sort of reacting to the fallout from the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where, you know, this typical marketplace approach that we have in the US, we realize that even if you didn't have an account within a company, they might have a profile and account for you. So you see a lot of the state laws like California and other states have focused as much on the transfer of personal information from one company to another, and then requiring certain safeguards, exceptions, consent, and everything like that. So that's more where we are. So we're using a lot of the same words, but we don't really mean the same thing. So for the US, to try to keep it brief, comprehensive federal legislation is unlikely. For anybody who's been following US politics, we can't even agree on a budget, let alone something like a comprehensive privacy law. So that's not going to happen. But states have stepped in to pick up this slack. So far we have 14 comprehensive privacy laws in different states. There are 40 bills pending right now. 5 are currently in effect, and more are coming into effect in 2024. 3 major states, Montana, Oregon, Texas. And then there's several more that come into effect in 2025. So there are some to really pay attention to, because some don't have revenue thresholds. So if you haven't been keeping up, it's time to sort of refresh what you're looking at to make sure that you understand how you can be impacted, even if you don't have offices or employees in particular states. Another potential big issue is Section 702 from FISA is up for renewal by April. And as several of you on the call probably know, this has caused much consternation for the EU, less so for the UK, but this is the surveillance statute. And so it still remains to be seen whether it's going to be renewed as it was, or whether there are going to be adjustments made to it. I will note that what's interesting is FISA actually gives more protections against surveillance while data is in the US, and less when it's outside of the US, for example, in the EU. So some of the decisions from the EU seem a little bit contradictory, at least from my personal perspective. The big focus areas will continue to be AI. Everything is AI all the time now. Children's privacy. I don't know if anybody saw the congressional hearing where they dragged Zuckerberg and others up in front of Congress to really grill them over issues of self-esteem and drug sales and everything else, and failing to do what they consider to be sufficient job of controlling and protecting children's safety. And then cybersecurity issues, including not only reporting and coordination between law enforcement and private entities, but also even getting into hardware level of trying to keep certain types of hardware from certain companies like Huawei out of networks, so that there's a less of a chance from the US perspective of there being security issues. You're going to see increased enforcement. FTC, SEC, and state level enforcement is really ramping up. And data transfers, including through cookies and similar technologies, will remain the focus of litigation. You really need to look at your cookies and your similar technologies, because so many people are getting sued today because you can go in and see what someone's doing without needing to get discovery, and you can judge it against whether they've gotten proper consent or disclosures or complied with the various different laws. So a lot more to talk about, but I'll wrap it up at that point.
Thank you very much, Todd. What I took from this is it sounds like in the US, we will still have to deal with essentially 50 jurisdictions as opposed to one, following the number of the states. So a fragmented picture there. And actually, I think it's really interesting that we now, at least 2 decades, well into the field of regulation of personal data, digital service, and the like. And it seems to me, instead of achieving more harmonization globally, we actually see more divergence, more fragmentation. But one of the things I'm picking up from what you guys are saying, which I think is promising, is at least it feels like the different regions are trying to regulate the same areas: data, privacy, digital services, cyber, competition, what have you. And maybe the principles are common, and that would be helpful to our clients. So without further ado, Zdeněk, I mean, surely the EU introduced the GDPR 5 years ago, and we've had this thing called the e-privacy directive regulating cookies and advertising for what? It's approaching 15 more years now. So surely not much is happening in the European Union, right?
Yeah, exactly, Antonis. European Union has recently introduced more than 20 regulations and directives that will affect digital business. What we see with our clients is that they do not understand even under which regulation they fall. We've been approached by many clients asking us about DMA, and we explained, you are not falling under DMA, you are falling under DSA, and vice versa. So it's becoming an over-regulated environment. And honestly, I think companies like e-shops, like retailers with very low margin, they will be extremely struggling in the upcoming years, because they will have to comply with those regulations. And even we as lawyers who have 15+ years of experience with technology, media, and telecommunication laws, we are struggling how they can understand that. This year will be affected mainly by, in my view, by 3 regulations and directives. First one is AI Act. We will be talking about that in the upcoming minutes quite a lot. So AI Act is already in final version, so we can understand, already read what kind of processes the companies, the clients should implement. Second one is cybersecurity. It's NIS2 directive, and for financial sector, financial and banking sector, fintech, it's DORA regulation. And the last one, which is actually not on the slide because it's not something that would be focused specifically on technology or digital business, and that is one of my favorite topics, and that is class action. European Union has introduced its own class action directive, and we think that it will completely change the environment because it will complement each and every regulation we have on the slide, and will introduce new forms of enforcement. Currently, in the European Union, we can see only several tenths of class actions being filed every year. Actually, UK has around 50, 60, and the whole European Union has the same number. But if you look at the trends, cybersecurity incidents, if you look at the trends with GDPR breaches, those are subject to new class actions across the European Union. Recently, class action has been filed in the Netherlands, actually against the company originally coming from the Czech Republic, and the class action is based on breach of privacy. So not only typical technology regulation should be on the radar of the clients, but also the class actions. If we look at the because all these regulations and directives, they have something in common. And I wrote down here 4 points. First, it's a creation or drafting an amendment of the documentation, in particular terms and conditions. So it's administrative work on side of our clients. Second, it's creation of specific positions with the clients. For example, NIS2 has a clear request creating auditors, cybersecurity specialists. Then obviously high sanctions. Every regulation and directive we have on the slide is no longer associated with 10,000 euros fine, but we are looking at worldwide profit usually. And the last point is extraterritoriality. Sorry, it's a complicated word for me as someone from the Czech Republic. These regulations like GDPR started with that. DSA, AI Act, they have a clear effect on the companies targeting the European Union, coming to the European Union, and therefore not only companies from Paris or Prague have to look at those regulations, but also those from US, China, Australia, and elsewhere. And I think that well, in 10 years' time, we will no longer have TMT specialists or IT law specialists, but we will have specialists just for cybersecurity, just for DSA, just for DMA, which may be the case right now for US or for UK, but not for the European Union. We have more generalists, but these times are over. So lots of going on in the European Union.
A lot is happening, Mr. Zdeněk, and thank you very much for this useful summary. I think you're right. It's an alphabet soup there. Then even for us who've spent months looking into these laws and trying to figure out what they're saying, still sometimes confusing. What exactly is the distinction between the Digital Act and the Digital Governance Act and what have you? I think the important points to bring out, as you suggested, are number one, all of these laws, when we think about privacy compliance and privacy program, each and every one of these laws has specific data provisions in them that would apply depending on your activities. Potentially, all of them might apply or most of them might apply. Number two, as Zdeněk said, very, very significant sanctions for non-compliance. I think the highest one I can remember, Zdeněk, now is the Digital Markets Act, 20% of annual worldwide turnover. Wow, that's absolutely massive. And it's representative of what's happening. And then the third, the curveball that's in all that, at least 3-4 years ago, the same applied in the UK, but now in the UK, the one-line summary is basically same as the EU, but different, because we're trying to make all of these laws, including the GDPR, a little bit more business friendly, a little bit more practical. The intentions are great, but I hear our clients, when they look at this picture and think about their global compliance, they're saying, well, it would help if the UK was not taking a different approach, because that's just yet another law for us to consider. But we can revisit those in more detail on another session. If we can go to the next slide, Natalie, please, before we move to the next topic. everyone, this is just a reminder that what we just discussed is just the key laws in 4 regions. There's a lot more happening, and just to prove the point, this is just a snapshot of a few examples of currently ongoing legislative initiatives, whether hard law or soft law guidance, codes of conduct, and what have you, just on AI, right? All this is happening right now. And when we start thinking about AI governance, we'll touch on that towards the end of the session, we need to be looking, we need to be on top of these things, figure out which ones are the most relevant and most helpful to us, and which ones are we going to use for our own compliance program. I think what we're left with is a question mark. If all that is happening, are there some areas for which we can take a global approach to compliance and achieve a degree of operational efficiency based on principles? And are there some areas where this is simply not possible? And to tease out that latter point, let's move to the next slide now, please. Natalie, use of cookies and targeted online advertising. So the adventure started in Europe as usual, right? And 20 plus years after the introduction of the privacy directive, and still it's difficult for organizations to figure out how they can lawfully monetize their website, a very, very simple day-to-day activity. So we'll focus now on this point, see what's the position around the world, and ask the question, is this one area where inevitably we'll have to take country-specific approaches, even within the European Union itself? If we can bring up our second survey, please, Niamh. Thank you very much. So again, what we're asking for here is, how do you solve this problem of diverse, non-harmonized laws around the world? And we've given you a few options, different shades of gray, ranging from taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So let's apply GDPR, for example, around the world. Let's just go for the highest standard, and hopefully should be okay globally, but maybe our revenue activities might take a massive hit. It can be bespoke, just take a country by country approach and comply with each law in each country all of the time. And then we have other variations, such as a hybrid risk-based approach, where you pick the jurisdictions that are really important for you, whether because they're big markets or are your home jurisdictions, and you really want to fully comply with the law there. And then for the rest of the world, take a more risk-based, principle-based approach. So please tell us what you think the solution is in practice. And while you're telling us what you think, let's start teasing out the issues around this. Kirsten, if I may start with you in Canada, what is the upshot around online advertising, and how peculiar is Canadian regulation of the issue?
Well, we actually don't regulate it, in the sense we don't have a particular statute like the e-privacy directive that's very specific about what it regulates. Instead, all of that is subsumed into our privacy legislation. So the tricky part in Canada is figuring out if what you are doing involves personal information, which you'd think would be easy, not so much. Quebec goes the furthest in its new law, and it requires certain technologies to be off by default, except cookies, off by default, except cookies. But if the cookies have certain functions, then they need to be, no, hold on, let me back up. See, I don't even understand this stuff. This is so difficult. In Quebec, certain technologies are allowed to be on by default, including cookies, except certain types of cookies. And if those cookies have certain functionalities, they have to be off by default. Those functionalities are profiling, tracking, and location. Pretty broad sweep. The profiling one is actually defined in the legislation and would capture targeted behavioral advertising, that kind of thing. The challenge with this off by default kind of approach is that that's a wholesale pivot for Canadian minds. So there's a lot of pushback on that. And I spend a lot of my time explaining to clients that, no, really, I haven't read the legislation wrong. No, off by default. Yes, I know that's going to destroy your business, but that's what the law says. Not surprisingly, not a lot of companies are happy to talk to me about that. The folks based in the EU mostly understand it. The e-privacy directive lines up fairly similarly. Folks in the US, not so much. I think Todd has some views on the US perspective on that. So it's a challenging environment right now. The rest of Canada doesn't follow the Quebec approach right now. It's just personal information. It's generally assumed to be non-sensitive personal information. So because we are a consent-based regime, we use this thing called implied consent. It looks a lot like the legitimate expectations or legitimate business interests under the GDPR, but it's not quite the same. So confusing jurisdiction. Frankly, most global companies are now starting to roll out consent management platforms. So Canadian consumers are getting used to the global deployment of those cookie banners. And the cookie banners tend to be compliant with the EU. So whether or not Canada has laws on this, the consumer expectation now is that they will be presented with a consumer or a cookie banner, and they will be allowed to put things on or off at their discretion. So I'm seeing an increase in complaints to companies, and therefore they land on my desk, about these sort of cookie, not having cookie banners, even though they're not required, companies are not required in Canada to have those.
Thank you, Kirsten. I think if there is a positive in what you said is that either as a result of the extraterritorial application of the GDPR or as a result of the Brussels effect, so whatever the EU legislates, then other governments are likely to follow the example, or as a result of market practice, at the end of the day, it feels like in Canada, for example, if you followed an EU-based approach for cookies, that should probably keep you out of trouble. But I appreciate there may be exceptions to that. Looking at the survey before we go to Todd, that was a great cue to Todd. Thank you, Kirsten. So Todd, before we come to you, there is a very clear preference among our clients, and we'll close the survey shortly and show the results. But as it's developing, it feels like 54% think that the way to go is you get a hybrid risk-based approach, comply in your key markets, take a principle-based approach in the rest of the world. So 2 quick questions for you, please. Well, 3 actually. What is happening with cookie regulation in the US? Second, does the hybrid approach resonate with you? And third, the same question as asked to Kirsten. If you take EU compliance steps for cookies, will you be okay in the US, you think?
Well, I'll start with your third question first. No, because we use similar language, but we don't mean the same thing. So just because you are compliant with GDPR, you might be wholly out of the requirements of the US. And that explains in part a lot of the litigation that's going on right now. Because as I mentioned before, sort of because of Cambridge Analytica, there's a big focus on when personal information is being provided by one party to another entity, including affiliates, right? So when you look at this, that's the whole function of cookies. So in California, for example, and again, we have this fragmented regulation across all these different states. Unless you fall within an exemption, you have to provide people with a right to do not sell my information. In other words, a right to opt out. When you provide that, up to 80% of the people or higher are opting out, because if you ask a consumer, hey, can I sell your information? They're going to say no. It's very rare that consumers will say, yeah, that's fine with me. And that's in part behind some of the moves that are causing a lot of turmoil in the ad tech industry, and why, for example, Google's doing away with cookies, because people have to find a way to deal with this whole situation of either providing opt-outs or not sending information to third parties. Now, even when you are not operating in a state in the US that has specific requirements around permitting people to opt out, you really have to think about, have you described accurately what you're doing with your cookies, with whom you're sharing this information, and the purposes for which you're sharing it? Because if you sit back and look at it, most people aren't. So I think that there's this idea that if you're not in one of those, problematic states, you're probably okay. And I would suggest that's not necessarily true. And I think that the reason why cookies tend to be a higher risk issue is because, again, as I mentioned earlier, plaintiffs and regulators can do a cookie audit on your site without having to ask you any questions and already determine that your information is getting shared with third parties. So I think it's something that's going to require a lot of work. I think it's going to raise a lot of political issues about, are we entitled to free services, or are companies allowed to force us to pay because we've taken away one of their means for revenue? So this isn't over. I don't think that the end state is clear yet, but we do know that as a company, if you're out there, you better pay very close attention to your cookies and similar type technology, or the people who are out trying to make a dollar, or the regulators will be looking at you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Todd. And if we can bring up the results, close the survey and bring up the results while we move to Australia. I think, Todd, I took 2 points from what you said. Number one, forget it. EU approaches will not cut it for you. In the US, you need to consider the specific provisions, in particular the sales provisions of the CCPA, etc. And second, you touched on pay or okay, the new model that seems to be emerging, which yesterday we found out from Kirsten, in Canada, it's not a thing. In the US is a thing. So Robin, as we move to you, I'm not sure if we can see the results of the survey now. So as we said, a very clear front runner, the hybrid risk-based approach. So Robin, over to you very briefly, please. What's the upshot with cookies and ad tech regulation in Australia? Is pay or okay a thing? And is it likely to be viable? And then if you have any comments on the survey, please share. You're on mute, Robin.
Thank you. As I mentioned before, there's a wholesale review of the Privacy Act down here. So at the moment, it's similar to the Canadian position where consent can be implied. And it's traditionally not been a lot of cookie banners being presented to you in the Australian market. And, I traveled recently to London and, oh my God, basically trying to deal with all the cookie banners that suddenly appeared on my phone.
Welcome to Europe.
Yeah, it sent me around the twist. And so that's going to change. But recently, there's also been a digital platform inquiry and specific inquiry by our competition regulator into the ad tech industry. And so there's but coming at it from a competition law perspective. So there's actually significant reform coming down here. Todd touched on something before which really resonated with me. The bigger risk in Australia traditionally has probably been from cyber washing or privacy washing. So companies saying that they're doing something and they're not actually doing it. And I've done plenty of advice work where people have presented me with their privacy notice and it reads like a sales tool, just about how great that company is and all of the amazing things they're doing, but they're not actually being transparent about what they're doing. They're bundling consents and that sort of thing. So I think that's, one of the significant risk issues is, basically, the competition law regulator taking action against you for misleading and deceptive conduct and cyber washing, really.
Thank you, Robin. So the way this is evolving, it seems to me cookies is one area where you really want to probably be taking specific regional approaches. Although if you wanted to, you can go over the top, go for the high GDPR watermark at least in Australia and Canada, and that should keep you away from regulatory enforcement trouble, although your head of marketing and CFO may have a thought or two about this practice. Zdeněk, we're running out of time for this particular session, and probably I'm not doing you much justice because there's just so much happening on cookies in Europe. So if in the next 4 minutes, you can just very briefly please tell us what is happening, what is the latest here? We're hearing a lot and we see a lot of our publisher clients essentially to the pay or okay model where either you accept advertising and you're not paying, or you don't have advertising, but you have to pay a monthly fee. So what is the latest that you're seeing in the market?
I will try to be very brief. If we look at the survey which was performed by various DPAs across the European Union, we can see that there are still very basic mistakes which are done by data processors. First, it's processing the cookies without the consent, which is very simple advice to the client. Please use the consent as a basis for processing of cookies that are non-technical, but this is still not happening in the European Union. So there is a strong push on the from the DPAs, data protection authorities, on correct categorization of the cookies, and then having consent as a correct basis for processing of non-technical cookies. Another thing is that very often it is not possible to withdraw from use of cookies. Basically, the data subjects, the customers of our clients, have no chance to opt out. And there is another thing that that was mentioned by that survey by DPAs, and that was that the data subjects were forced to grant the consent. This is still very often happening. But if I should say one thing, one recommendation to the audience, what to focus on, that is a preliminary, a request for preliminary rolling in case C604/22, and that is AIB. That is the case which was initiated against the appellant Interactive Advertising Bureau Europe. I trust lots of you have heard about that. The thing is that this decision of the European Court of Justice will basically change the whole environment, because currently real-time bidding, programmatic advertisement, most of that is based on AI-based AIB standard, which was developed over the years and is widely used across the European Union. You probably know that a few years back, the Belgian Data Protection Authority was fighting against that. There was a decision, local decision, which basically considered this standard as improper, in violation of GDPR, and that is now being subject to preliminary ruling. This may completely change this issue across the European Union. So please, please keep this in mind. And if I was to answer the question, what is the future of the cookies in the European Union, it's pretty much dependent on the decision of European Court of Justice first, and second, pretty much decision dependent on the e-commerce directive, which is still non-existent at its final version. Yep.
So Zdeněk, first of all, thank you very much. I think we should wrap this piece up because we need to leave at least 10 minutes to discuss AI. You know, we'll do AI in 10 minutes. That's quite arrogant, actually, but we'll try to do our best. I think it's, as a minimum, it's absurd that we still don't have any clarity in Europe about how on earth you can lawfully monetize your website. Every solution that is being proposed for the last 20 years, all of them are being shut down in turn. IAB-TCF, well, it was by far from being a perfect solution, but it was the only solution we had that worked. That's being challenged. Pay or OK, the solution that some of our clients are seeing after the recent judgments of the CJEU, which basically said you can only do targeted advertising in the EU with consent, already is being challenged both by privacy activists and by regulators. And the most concerning thing for me, at least, is that even the UK, in the UK, last week we had a big conference here in the UK, and the Information Commissioner, John Edwards, laid out his priorities for the year. And there were AI, high-risk issue, children's issues, high-risk issue, and cookies and targeted advertising, which is frustrating because when he took the position 2 years ago, he said, I don't think online advertising is high risk. So that creates a lot of issues for our clients. And to summarize the whole piece, I think we're saying cookies and ad tech, probably you need to look specifically on a country-by-country basis. In some more pragmatic jurisdictions like Australia and Canada, you may be able to approaches that will help you in other parts of the world, but in the US you can't. And in the EU and the UK, unfortunately, we seem to continue going crazy around technical compliance and going 150% on the privacy side and not thinking about innovation and free speech and the right to create revenue at all. But that's for another discussion. So if we can now move to our third topic with just 10 minutes to go, AI governance. Niamh, if you can please bring out the survey, and everyone in the audience, again, we're asking you to tell us, we know that all these things are really challenging around AI, but we really want you to tell us which one of all these you find really, really the most challenging. And the reason why we're asking these questions and looking at AI in the context of a privacy session is because, of course, AI is about much, much more than just privacy, but a lot of it is about data, a lot of it is about data governance and privacy, and inevitably, AI regulation is going to have a direct impact on our privacy program and compliance efforts. So please tell us what you think is the most challenging. And to start the discussion, Todd, can I start with you on this particular point? How does the advent of AI regulation impact our clients' privacy program and privacy compliance efforts?
Yeah, it's interesting because as somebody educated as an engineer, I think that the hype over AI is just out of control at the moment. The way I would view it is it's a tool, and it doesn't change the governance and the compliance structures you need, except that you need to understand the exact types of AI that you're using, if you are, or that your partners are using. You need to be sure that if the AI is the type that can adjust or morph or change over time, whether that be from a programmatic standpoint so that it changes, you have to have a structure that reviews that over time to make sure that the changes are continuing to have the results that you want and are continuing to be used in the way that you want them. Or if you have an AI model that is taking in information or sharing information, you need to have a way to ensure that that information remains accurate and that you're continuing to comply with your goals for that information. So it's not so much that what you need to do has changed, but rather the tools that you are trying to govern may have changed. And you need to have a really strong partnership between your IT department, your compliance, your legal, and your management to make sure that all of the aspects and facets of this challenge are being addressed by people who understand those various facets. So with the little time left, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Todd. And the rest of the Dentons team, if we could please go on rapid fire mode for your comments and contributions. I should say the survey is shaping up, is producing some interesting results, which are different to what we saw last night, actually. So by far, the number one concern our clients have is privacy and confidentiality, the novel issues that AI creates or the existing privacy issues that it compounds. If you add data quality and quantity, again, a data governance and privacy issue, that all adds up to around 43%. And then the second one is regulation of AI and how to stay on top and develop an AI governance framework. So armed with that information, Kirsten, what is your view? What is the impact of AI on privacy regulation? And is there anything in the survey that catches your attention?
Something that I'm seeing, and I think this is reflected in the survey, is this sense of not understanding the technology. And I see many groups, legal groups, privacy officers, they don't know what questions to ask, or no questions are being asked. So AI-enabled vendors, AI-enabled technologies are being onboarded and either have gone no governance at all because no one thinks of them as having AI or using AI, or they've been an inadequate assessment. And I can give you an example of that. We recently did a seminar to one of our clients, and they were doing the right thing. They wanted to understand what questions to ask and who to ask them of and how to handle AI. And they wanted to get ahead of it before any AI was used in the organization. And so one of my Clumber students immediately went onto the internet and started Googling their name and found out that they'd already bought just recently 2 Boston Dynamics AI-enabled dogs that they were using and had deployed. And legal knew nothing about this, in part because no one had thought of them as AI. They were just these little cool robot things. So that's an example of how you regulate. How do you regulate something when no one thinks of it as being AI or privacy or using information? And the number one question we're getting, and this actually reassures me that companies are trying to do the right thing, it's how do we govern this stuff in the absence of laws? And in Canada in particular, we have lots of principles right now, but we have nothing that's binding, and nobody wants to try and put a governance framework in only to have to change it when the laws then are crystallized. So companies are really grappling with how to put together a governance framework. Fortunately, we're starting to see a coalescence of some principles around this, so it's certainly easier now than it was even 12 months ago.
Thank you, Kirsten. And I think you're making a great point. Just to touch on the we don't know what we don't know point, a banking client recently was telling me, well, we did an AI inventory exercise to map what AI we're using. We're expecting to find around 5 or 6 AI applications. Turned out it was over 65. And that was a big bank, right? A big entity with resources and a compliance culture. So it's an interesting snapshot of the problem. I think the very interesting point you're making is, how do we govern before laws, before binding laws? And, careful what you wish for. I think there's an element that if we look at all these principles and forthcoming laws now, we can draw principles and we can build governance controls, and we can get our AI adoption and AI governance off the ground before the mandatory draconian provisions of some laws start biting. So, Zdeněk, on that note, Niamh, have we shared the results of the survey? Thank you very much. So, as previewed, privacy and confidentiality number 1, regulation of AI, and the point that Kirsten was making, how do you understand the risk and govern it in the meantime, close number 2, very consistent with what we heard last night. Zdeněk, over to you for a very, very quick comment, please, before we also pass to Robin before we wrap it up.
In the European Union, it is quite straightforward. We already have the final version of AI Act. We expect that it should be in force this year, 2024, and then the companies, they have up to 36 months to get ready to be compliant fully with AI Act. There are some other periods, even shorter, for example, when the companies have to refrain from using the most complicated AI systems. And we already see from the processes contemplated by AI Act that it will pretty much go hand in hand with GDPR assessment with the companies. So when you implement AI tool with the client, then we expect, for example, to perform fundamental rights impact assessment together with DPIA. So it will be one documentation. It is even contemplated by AI Act. We expect that there will be a human overview at it, and it can be done by DPO. We expect certain documentation to be prepared, and this can be prepared by privacy experts. So for the processes already where we are getting ready the clients for AI Act, we are basically talking to the same people that are responsible for GDPR. However, and now I go back to the first speaker in this part, I fully agree that we need more technicians to be involved first, to be sure that we are actually talking about something that falls within the definition of AI. And second, because there is a very strong request by AI Act to keep the locks. And I will stop here because it would require separate discussion.
Actually, so Zdeněk, thank you very much, especially for being punctual. Robin, you'll have 2 minutes. Just to very briefly say, all these points you mentioned made sense, with one exception. I don't think the EU AI Act is simple, whether to comply within the EU or to use it as a base for global compliance. But as you said, we need another session. Actually, Dentons will be running a series of AI events over the next 12 months, and we're going to go deep on each and every of the pertinent issues. Robin, you have the final word.
Sure. Well, no doubt that AI's peak hype cycle, as I think Kirsten once explained to me in another session. And so, I think in absence of really having any law here, you know, for me, the areas of focus are probably going to be around transparency and accountability. And so it comes back to the point that, you know, that's coming out in the poll as well, which is it's very difficult to understand, you know, how this stuff actually works. And that's what people are really grappling with, you know, that they don't really understand how it works. And certainly companies that are vendors of AI solutions aren't about to explain it either, because that's their secret sauce and that's, you know, the competitive advantage they've got. So there is this fundamental tension there, you know, where you're trying to achieve transparency and accountability, and you want to do your testing and things like that, but you can't. I think the thing that really surprised me about the poll is, you know, and I, in some ways, you know, I'm surprised that people aren't more concerned about copyright and intellectual property. You know, I think that there's not enough asking about, you know, what are these things being trained on, and where are the data sets and what are the legitimate rights to use it. And I think there's some of the pickle that, you know, I'm seeing that companies are in, and, you know, that some of the lawsuits that are going on now, the frontier really is around, you know, well, what right do you have to take that information in the first place to train it? And so that is the frontier. You know, it's been an utter failure of IP and copyright law. I think that we're in that sort of pickle. So, you know, in a nutshell, I'd say keep a watching brief, obviously develop your own principles, but, you know, that's one of the challenges that, you know, people have got.
Thank you very much, Robin. So look, and to be fair, all the issues we've listed there are all important and risky. We ask people to tell us what is your top concern. It appears IP is not, and it's other things, but totally agree with you. I think one thing that is being underestimated is the skills gap, as you again alluded to. But anyway, let's wrap it up here. I think everyone, as we were trying to convey with these slides, unlike cookies and similar technologies, we think here at Dentons that AI is one of these things where at least for the next 2 to 3 years, you can generally take a global approach to your AI governance. On that note, we wrap it up. Thank you all very much for attending. We hope it was useful. Niamh, back to you.
Thank you, Antonis. I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone for your time and for attending today. I also want to say thanks to our panel for hosting such a lively discussion on such a complex area. I would encourage you, if you're struggling with any of these issues, if you'd like a sounding board, please do reach out to our speakers, because they'd love to hear from you and to continue the conversation. I want to say thank you for the time, thought and consideration they put into today's session. We'd love to hear your feedback. Let us know what you thought of the session, either in the chat now or via our normal email address, and of course you can request slides also. We still have a number of sessions coming up over the coming weeks, so we're looking forward to seeing everyone back online as we close out this series of our client experience program. Thank you for joining today and wishing you a great day wherever in the world you are.